Georgia, a small and unassuming country on the Black Sea coast with a population of only 3.7 million, has somehow recently managed to produce 6 current UFC fighters, and 2 of them became UFC champions, Merab Dvalishvili and Ilia Topuria, as well as producing countless other champions in wrestling, judo, weightlifting, boxing, kickboxing. Not to mention, they also have a pretty good rugby team. Georgia's success in combat sports is no coincidence. There are deep reasons behind it linked to its geography, its history, culture, that seem to translate very well into producing some of the toughest MMA fighters in the world. Georgia is located in the South Caucasus, at the intersection of Europe and Asia. About 85% of the country is mountainous, with the Greater Caucasus Range forming its northern border and the Lesser Caucasus to the south. This terrain made it very difficult to conquer, but also physically demanding for the people who lived there. Today, ethnic Georgians make up around 87% of the country's population. Unlike many of its neighbors, Georgia is pretty much homogeneous, especially when compared to other regions like Dagestan, which is one of the most ethnically diverse areas in the world. Georgia is also one of the first countries in the world to adopt Christianity, as far back as the 4th century, before even most European countries became Christian. And despite all the centuries of invasions that they faced by Persians, Arabs, Mongols, Ottomans, and Russians, Georgia managed to preserve its Christian identity and traditions, which is very central and very important to its national culture today. The Georgian alphabet is also unique in its appearance, and the exact origin has never been fully established. But in its structure, the Georgian alphabet is very similar to the Greek alphabet, with the exception of letters that they have that are uniquely for Georgian sounds, which are grouped at the end. As for the name, Georgians don't call themselves Georgians in their language. It's an exonym likely linked to Saint George, their patron saint, and in their own language they're called Kartveli, and the country is known as Sakartvelo, a name that comes from the ancient kingdom of Kartli, the heart of early Georgian civilization. Living in the mountains meant people were constantly on the move, climbing steep slopes, working rugged land, and herding animals across difficult terrain. Over the generations, for Georgians, daily life itself was much like endurance training and naturally built strength and stamina in its people. The population density in Georgia gets lower at higher altitudes, but there are still Georgians who live in isolated mountain villages where the thinner air forces the body to adapt over generations, improving lung capacity and oxygen efficiency. It's the same kind of natural mountain conditioning you see in other regions like Dagestan or Chechnya. The village of Ushguli in the Svaneti region is considered to be one of the highest continuously inhabited settlements in Europe, sitting at around 2,100 meters or 6,900 feet above sea level. Unlike other parts of the Caucasus that remained landlocked, Georgia has a coastline, the Black Sea. This opened the region to trade, contact, and cultural exchange far earlier than many of its neighbors. In ancient times, this coast connected Georgia to the ancient Greek world. The Greeks called Georgia Kolkis. It held an almost mythical status in their imagination. Kolkis was believed to be the final destination of Jason and the Argonauts, who sailed there in search of the Golden Fleece. While the story is a myth, Kolkis itself was a real, powerful and wealthy kingdom known for being rich with gold, honey, and wine, and would export its resources mainly to the ancient Greek city-states. Excavations at sites like Vani, a major city in ancient Kolkis, have unearthed numerous artifacts associated with wine consumption, suggesting wine drinking was very important in ancient Georgian culture. It was even said that the people of Kolkis worshipped Dionysus, the Greek god of wine. Georgia has a very long tradition of wrestling going back to ancient times. Nobody really knows how it started, it could have been through the connections to the ancient Greek world that they were introduced to Greco-Roman wrestling, but no one really knows for sure. But what we do know for sure is that Georgia has a long history of grappling martial arts, and it's embedded in their culture. One example of this is Chidauba, an ancient form of wrestling that's been practiced across Georgia for centuries, probably since before recorded history. Chidauba was originally used to help prepare men for war, especially during medieval times when Georgia was constantly under threat from neighboring empires. And over time, it evolved into a more structured sport, but it still holds on to that original warrior ethos. In fact, the current UFC bantamweight champion, Merab Dvalishvili, started off training in Chidauba, which you can clearly see the influence of in some of his takedowns and throws. He also trained Kridoli at a young age. That's another Georgian traditional martial art, which I'll get into later in the video. Chidauba looks a bit like a mix of wrestling and judo. It also blends in traditional music and ritual dances, and the fighters wear a traditional wool coat called the choka. And the matches take place in open-air arenas with live music playing at the rhythm of the wrestlers. Sort of like in traditional Muay Thai fights in Thailand, where they have music to go along with the pace of the fight. There are over 200 recognized throws and holds in Chidauba. The style focuses on balance, timing, and explosive movements, which is part of why a lot of these Georgian wrestlers transitioned so well into sports like judo and MMA. Since Georgia gained independence in 1991, it's already gotten 5 Olympic gold medals in judo, which is an incredible achievement for a country of just 3.7 million people. In fact, per capita, that makes it one of the most successful judo nations in the world. Going back to Chidauba, it also has a unique code of conduct. It's about honor, matches are respectful, they often end with a handshake. And today, it's widely practiced in villages across Georgia, where kids learn by watching and imitating. And for many of Georgian fighters, this is where it all starts. Historically, Georgia sat directly on the Silk Road, making it a valuable link between Europe, Persia, Central Asia, and the Mediterranean. But this also meant constant pressure from their powerful neighbors. Over the centuries, the region was invaded or ruled at different times by the Romans, the Persians, the Byzantines, Arabs, Mongols, Ottomans, and Russians. Despite all of this, Georgia maintained a distinct national identity. The period between the 11th and 13th centuries is often called Georgia's Golden Age, marked by a unified monarchy, territorial expansion, and major achievements in architecture, literature, and religious scholarship. Under King David IV, known as David the Builder, and Queen Tamar, Georgia became a regional power with a strong centralized state and a respected military. During this time, Georgian warriors weren't just fighting for survival and protecting their borders. They were expanding and defending trade routes. They almost had a small empire at one point. Georgian warriors were highly trained and heavily armored, often wearing chainmail, carrying sabers, and using cavalry tactics that blended both European knightly style and steppe style of warfare. And the reputation of Georgian warriors reached far beyond their borders in the 13th century. If you've ever heard of the Mamluks, they were these elite soldiers in the Muslim armies from Egypt and Syria. The Mamluks were mostly taken from Georgia as slaves and trained to be elite soldiers in Muslim armies. That was a practice that they did for centuries. And these Mamluks eventually rose up and revolted against their masters and created their own kingdoms in the Middle East. Some Georgian and Circassian Mamluks would even found their own dynasty in Iraq, which would control Iraq until the 18th century. There's also an interesting story from the 19th century, where a Russian officer and ethnographer named Arnold Zisserman, he spent decades in the Caucasus, and he came across these people called the Kevsur, who are these kind of highlanders in northeastern Georgia, and he claimed that they were descended from the last European crusaders. He based this on similarities in their weapons, armor, their clothing, and he even noted that they still wore chainmail and crosses into the 1800s. A lot of modern scholars completely discredited the idea. The myth itself says a lot about how Georgia's martial identity captured the imagination of outsiders. And the Kevsur Highlanders, well into the 1800s, were still wearing chainmail and using their traditional weapons from medieval times. So when you look at the photographs taken of the Kevsurs, you're actually looking at what Georgian warriors probably would have looked like in medieval times, which is fascinating. And the Kevsurs also preserved a martial arts system. So the weapons and armor that they had, it wasn't just for show, they actually trained with them. And their martial art is known as Khridoli. And it includes striking, grappling, even sword fighting techniques. And it's a remnant of the military culture in Georgia that goes back centuries. In the 20th century, like the rest of the Caucasus region, Georgia was taken over by the Russian Empire and later became part of the Soviet Union. During this time, Georgia's political, cultural, and religious life was heavily suppressed. Churches were destroyed, and the Georgian language was pushed aside in favor of Russian in many areas. Ironically, one of the most notorious figures in Soviet history, Joseph Stalin, was himself a Georgian, born Yoseb Jugashvili in the town of Gori. But Stalin showed no special favor to his own people. In fact, his purges hit Georgia particularly hard. Thousands of intellectuals, people from the clergy, and political dissidents were executed and imprisoned during his rule. Despite all of this, Soviet industrialization brought some infrastructure and modernization, but at a heavy cost to the culture and identity of Georgia. Under the Soviet system, Georgia quickly stood out as one of the strongest hubs for wrestling. Many Georgian athletes won gold medals competing under the Soviet flag. The Georgian wrestling style, which was based on powerful throws, control, and balance, translated perfectly into the Soviet combat sports system. Athletes often trained across multiple disciplines, and the culture of intense technical training became deeply embedded. When Georgia gained their independence from the Soviet Union in 1991, its fighters finally began competing under their own flag. But they brought that same elite mentality with them. And today, the legacy is showing up in a new arena: mixed martial arts. There's also two regions that I need to mention, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, which broke away from Georgian control during the bloody war that they had in the 1990s, right after the collapse of the Soviet Union. When Georgia declared independence, these two specific regions within Georgia, which were historically in Georgia, broke away from Georgia and wanted to remain with Russia. So that led to a war. The Russians backed the Abkhaz rebels, and they killed thousands of ethnic Georgian civilians and forced hundreds of thousands more of them to flee away from the region. Some of them fled to Europe. One of those families was the family of Ilia Topuria. Ilia Topuria's family is actually from the region of Abkhazia, and that's the reason why he was born in Germany and later grew up in Spain. So yeah, this isn't accidental, it's not a coincidence. It is the result of the culture, the martial arts culture, the history, the geography. It all came together to create an environment that produced some of the toughest MMA fighters in the world. And that's why they will continue to do well in the sport and other combat sports in the future. And you're going to see a lot more Georgian fighters coming up after this, because usually when there's a champion from a small country, like we saw in Dagestan with Khabib, it creates a ripple effect. It inspires more people to follow in their footsteps. So you're going to see a lot more Georgian fighters in the years to come. Thank you for watching. If you liked that video, don't forget to hit subscribe, leave a like, leave a comment, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Take care.